Hi, I'm Joyce Harper, Professor of Reproductive Science at the Institute for Women's Health at University College London. Welcome to Season 3 of my podcast, Why Didn't Anyone Tell Me This? This season, we'll be diving into topics that explore how to achieve good health and happiness. I'll be speaking with leading experts who will provide evidence-based advice and debunk some of the many myths around our health. Additionally, I'll be having conversations with individuals who bring unique perspectives through their lived experiences. In Season 3, we'll cover a diverse range of topics, including reproductive anatomy, inspiring female icons, chronic health conditions, factors that influence our well-being, and global women's health issues. I really hope you enjoy Season 3 of Why Didn't Anyone Tell Me This? Welcome to another episode in the mini-series on female icons. And today we have a double offering, as we are going to hear about Elizabeth Garrett Anderson, the UK's first female doctor, but also about the inspiring life of Dr. Lucy Havard. Lucy has always had a passion for medicine and history, and through her career, she has spent time studying both. First, Lucy took a medical degree at University College London, graduating in 2013. During her third year of medicine, she took an intercalated year studying the history of medicine at the Wellcome Library in London. After working full-time as a medical doctor for 4 years, she decided to pursue her interest in history further, undertaking a master's in history and philosophy of science at UCL. Whilst continuing her work as a doctor, she completed an Early Modern History MPhil at the University of Cambridge in 2019. And now Lucy has almost completed her PhD, which builds on her MPhil study to examine the early modern home as a space for knowledge making. As well as all of this, in 2021, Lucy was awarded an Extraordinary Blue at the University of Cambridge for the triathlon. And a few weeks ago, she was president of the Cambridge female rowing team, leading them to victory against Oxford. Wow. Welcome, Lucy.
Thank you very much for having me.
So, we are going to talk about female icons today, but I first wanted to ask you a little bit about yourself, Lucy. So, I want to learn more about you, and I love how your career has changed from medicine to history. So, can you tell us more about your career journey?
Yeah, of course. I've always sort of been interested in history. And when I was in my final year of school, I couldn't decide basically whether I wanted to go to university and study history or whether I wanted to study medicine. And both of my parents are GPs, so I kind of had a bit of an insight into what being a doctor was like. And I saw what they were doing, and I thought, yeah, I think I could do that. I think I would enjoy that. And so I guess I went for medicine because I had more experience of it, really. But throughout my medical degree, I didn't lose my interest in history, and I'd done English and history both at A level along with biology and chemistry, which was a bit unusual then, doing sort of both the arts and the sciences. But I just didn't want to drop them because I enjoyed them so much. So I went to UCL Medical School. I did my first 2 years, and then in the third year, we had the opportunity to intercalate. So you could do a year of a different subject. So lots of people did things that were kind of medically related. So maybe biochemistry or pharmacology or physiology or something like that. But there was the option to do history of medicine, which is what I opted for. And so I was at the Wellcome Library in London for a year. It was probably my favourite year of the whole medical degree. I absolutely loved it. And it was fantastic. I mean, the Wellcome Library, if you've ever been, it's on Euston Road. It's a free library. It's amazing. I just love going there and working there. It's really lovely place to just be. And so that was sort of a year of history again. And then after that, I kind of got swept up in the whole clinical school side of things. So we're in hospitals at that point, doing various different placements, and I really enjoyed it and I loved it. And I still love being a doctor, and it is an amazing career that I really do enjoy. And so I graduated from UCL. I ended up working for 4 years. And at that point, I'd sort of come to a natural break in my career. And I was at the point where I needed to decide what specialty I wanted to pursue. And I wasn't quite sure. I thought maybe gastroenterology, maybe acute medicine. I hadn't quite made up my mind. And because I wasn't sure, I decided to take a year out, and I wanted to do something useful. I wanted to do something where I felt I'd achieved something. And so I ended up applying for a master's at UCL in history and philosophy of science. And so I did that, and that was sort of like going back to university and doing a full-time degree. And I did a few shifts at hospitals, a few different hospitals during that year as well, just so that I didn't forget everything, and earned a bit of money that way as well. But I was predominantly doing history. And that's sort of what really got me into early modern history, which is the area of history that I specialize in at the moment. So I mostly look at the sort of 17th and 18th centuries. And my dissertation, which I did during that master's, really set me up for what I'm doing today. So it was at that point that I came across this amazing source, or class of sources, I suppose, or genre, which is the manuscript recipe book. So I decided that I wanted to do something on my dissertation which was about women and science. But I wasn't really sure about anything more than that. And my supervisor at the time, called Simon Werrett, he's fantastic. He's an amazing historian. And he's specifically a historian of science. And he said, have you thought about looking at these manuscript recipe books? And I never even heard of what a manuscript recipe book was. So there were loads at the Wellcome Library, which was just around the corner. And so I went and had a look, and there are these incredible manuscripts that contain recipes not just for food and drink, but also for medicines, for cleaning, like treatments and tips and tricks for using like around the home, basically. And they also contain lots of other things, like sometimes they might have sketches or diagrams in them. Sometimes they might have a bit of family history. Sometimes they might have songs or poems or bits of the Bible, sort of religious writings. They're really eclectic kind of sources. And the thing that really drew me to them was that they were often compiled by women, or women often played a big part in the creation of these manuscripts. And they were often passed down through families, often from mother to daughter, although men were certainly involved in sort of their compilation. And we know that, there are marks of ownership of men as well. But in terms of thinking about the sort of 17th century, there aren't that many, or certainly men massively outnumber women in terms of the resources that are written by them. So they're quite unique in that sense. And I really sort of got completely wrapped up in these manuscripts and just loved sort of working with them. And each one was a bit different. And you could really get, there are some really like personal insights into what people thought of a particular recipe, or what they used it for, or how effective they thought it was, which it was almost like I felt very privileged to kind of be able to read these resources, because it felt quite private, and sort of a form of life writing. And in that way, it was kind of a bit like medicine, because I feel when you're a doctor, you're in a very privileged position as well. People are telling you their sort of, sometimes very secretive things, sometimes things that they're embarrassed about, sometimes, very sort of intimate things. And I kind of got a similar sort of feeling when I was looking at these manuscripts as well, that they were very private and not necessarily for sort of public view, if you like. So I did that year and loved doing my dissertation and really, really enjoyed it. And then I'd sort of, at that point, I'd been in London for 11 years, and I thought, well, it's time to move out. So I decided that I wanted to move to Cambridge. And I ended up getting a job at Addenbrooke's Hospital, which is the main hospital in Cambridge, and working as an acute medicine clinical fellow, because I felt, well, time to go back to medicine now. I've done my history bit. But while I was working, I sort of realized that I really did want to do a bit more of history, and I hadn't quite finished. And so I ended up applying for an MPhil in early modern history at Cambridge, and I didn't really think I was going to get a place. I didn't think my chances were that great, but it was something that I was really interested in and very sort of excited about. And I ended up getting a place, and I was absolutely thrilled. I was at Lucy Cavendish College, which at that point was an all-female college as well for mature students, so students over 21. And I did my MPhil there. And my research at that point kind of transitioned a bit, in that I was looking very much at sort of domestic history, and particularly at that point, the kitchen. So I was looking at the 17th century kitchen as a space for experimentation, and basically a space for sort of science production, if you like. And essentially arguing that domestic spaces were really, really important. It wasn't always, early modern science didn't just happen in the Royal Society or these sort of early sort of scientific institutions that were kind of cropping up at this time. So I did a year doing my MPhil and loved it. And then was like, well, now I really do need to go back to medicine. I've got to choose my specialty, and get on with that. So I ended up, I decided to pursue a career in renal medicine, so kidneys, nephrology, and I worked for a year and then decided that I really did want to do a PhD. And so I did a year and 8 months of my training for nephrology, and then ended up starting my PhD. And I've just done 3 years of my PhD. And I still do on calls at the hospital. I actually did a night shift last night. So I'm still doing on calls at Addenbrooke's, which I do really enjoy. And I've sort of realized, I've been ping ponging quite a bit between medicine and history and doing one then the other. And I have sort of come to the conclusion that really I do want to do both and carry on doing both. And so I'm going to do my best to actually sort of have a dual career and try and attempt to be a part-time doctor and a part-time historian, because I'd love to sort of lecture and teach in history, because teaching is such a massive part of medicine. And, I love teaching in medicine, and teaching in history is pretty awesome too. So I'd love to be able to do both. But that's a very long and rather convoluted history of my career to date. But it's not been it's certainly not typical. It's not conventional, but it's kind of how I've got to where I am today.
Lucy, I love the unconventional. So what a great it was my boss that told me that I should ask you to talk about the first women that graduated as medics in the UK. And then when I've looked into you on what you were doing, I was like, wow, but Lucy's so fascinating. And we are going to before we get on to female icons, we're going to talk a bit more about you, because you are so fascinating. So 2 more things about you. So you have been awarded an extraordinary blue for triathlon, which I must admit that even though I
Yeah.
live near Cambridge, I didn't know what it was. So I had to Google it, but I know what it is now. But can you tell us what this award is? Because it's also amazing.
Yeah, so a blue is basically it's the highest kind of sporting award you can get at Cambridge. An extraordinary blue is an extraordinary blue isn't better than a regular blue. It just means that for some reason or other, you're unable to satisfy the official criteria that you need to get a blue. And so you've done something different, which has sort of proven that you are of the same expected standard as a blue, as a regular blue, if you like. So for me, I got my triathlon blue in 2019, 2020 when COVID happened. And the problem was that because of COVID, the sort of the normal varsity match that you'd have between Oxford and Cambridge, which you would normally need to compete in order to get a blue, was cancelled because of COVID. But because I'd done well at the sort of varsity duathlon, which is just the cycling and the running bit, and I'd also represented Great Britain for my age group in the September just before I started in triathlon, I sort of had enough evidence to show that I was of the expected standard. So I was awarded a blue for that, which was, yeah, pretty cool. I mean, I'd not even really considered it before coming to Cambridge, but it really was sort of a bit of a dream, sort of being able to be awarded that. So it was lovely.
Wow, you are an extraordinary woman. So, without the medicine and the history, you're also a fantastic athlete. And when we were planning this, we were going to record this podcast last week, but we had to postpone because you'd lost your voice
I
because
had.
you had the most amazing, you led the women's Cambridge rowing team to victory. And so, tell us about that. So, all these other things you're doing, and then you've
Yeah.
done that. You're amazing.
I mean, rowing really has become a very big part of my sort of my student life, and it has kind of defined, or it's been one of the certainly big defining points of my career as a student, I guess. So this year I was elected president of the open weight women at Cambridge University Boat Club. And we compete in the boat races against Oxford each year. And this year we were fortunate enough to have what's known as a clean sweep, which means that we won basically all the races. So we won the um, blues races for both the men and the women, the reserve races, the lightweight races, and we also won the spares races as well. So it was a pretty phenomenal weekend, and there was a lot of cheering and a lot of shouting. So I did lose my voice for about 2 days, but it was really amazing. I mean, I think being president is definitely the hardest thing I've ever done. I think it was a real challenge, and especially this year we had lots of challenges, but it was also the most rewarding thing, and I honestly feel I have got so much out of it. It's also not just about the boat races. It's about the friendships that you make and the relationships you build and the sort of the skills you learn as well, sort of from being in that kind of position. Yeah, I mean, it's really, I would do it again in a heartbeat, I think.
I'm sure people have said this to you before, but you must have more hours in the day than everybody else. I get asked that
um,
as well.
it's time management, I think, is kind of critical. But no, I mean, for me, actually being part of um, a rowing program when you are doing 12 sessions a week and your day is sort of sandwiched between training, it does actually really help me structure my day. So I know that well, I've got a window of 2 hours here. I have to get this done. And actually, I find it very useful. It does. It makes me get up early in the morning. It makes me get on with my day. You can be at work at 9 o'clock and at your desk, having done a session in the morning on the river, and then work until 4 when you've got training again, and then dinner in bed basically. But the routine actually works very well for me, I think. So yeah.
You really really are inspiring to younger women. So I think that's totally amazing. And I do go swimming in the Cam, but and I do kayak on
Mhm.
it. What time do you have to be on the river for your morning training? I know it's early.
So we're normally on the river at about 6:35, I would say, but we row at Ely. So we row on the Great
Ah.
Ouse River. So we actually have to be up. Well, I get up at sort of 5 o'clock, 10 past 5, and then you have to cycle to the station, and then you get the train from Cambridge to Ely. So we normally get the 5:57 train, and then it's a matter of getting from the train station to the boathouse, and then you do your session, and then it's the reverse on the way back. So yeah, I mean, there is a bit of travel involved, but it is also, I mean, Ely is a fantastic place to row. It's a very long, straight river, mostly, and it's great for training. So yeah, it's definitely worth it.
Yeah,
Worth the commute.
perfect. I do swim on the Ouse as well. But right, let's get down to some history about women and education in the UK. So after we'd arranged to do this podcast, I actually went on a walking tour of Cambridge, and I'm trying to do more walking tours of cities now. It's something I've never done, and it was so fascinating that hearing the history of when women started university in the UK. And I
Mhm.
believe it was University of London, which allowed women to study first. The number I've got was 1868, and it took just 10 years to actually allow them to graduate in London. But I was told on the tour that Cambridge and Oxford took a bit longer, and that they allowed women to study but did not offer full degrees. For Oxford, it was 1920, and Cambridge, we were a bit embarrassing,
Mm,
1948. So
yeah,
what was it
it's
like
bad,
for
isn't it?
women to be at university in these times? 1948, so recent.
I know it kind of feels quite backwards, doesn't it? Because yeah, I mean, it must have been incredibly hard. You can imagine you're putting the same amount of work in, you're doing the same exams, you're getting just as good marks, or maybe even better, as was the case for Elizabeth Garrett Anderson, that I know we're going to talk about later, in terms of comparing her results to those of her male peers. And yet you're not being given or awarded the bit of paper that says that you've reached this qualification. So yeah, I think it must have been incredibly difficult. And I'm just so sorry for those women that they had to go through that before we've got to sort of the present day when things are a bit more equal. Although, there's certainly still a way to go, in certain areas. But yeah, I think just incredibly, incredibly hard. And it must have felt very, very unjust and unfair. So yeah.
Yeah, it's I was at an event recently and someone said it's an awesome time to be a woman right now. And I know some women probably don't think that, but I really want to show today what it was like for those women relatively
Mhm.
recently who just couldn't even study properly. So let's look at the history
Yeah.
of women in medicine. And I know that you
Mm.
became first. Well, you told us about your interest in history, and you did a lot of work about the
Mm.
first female doctors and surgeons. And I work at the Elizabeth Garrett Anderson Institute for Women's Health. And we've talked long and hard
Mhm.
about whether we should have this really long title to our institute.
Mhm.
But we felt it was really important to remember Elizabeth Garrett Anderson. So, can you tell us more about her? And I believe she went to her first lecture in 1860. So, tell us more about Elizabeth.
Yeah, of course. So Elizabeth Garrett Anderson, yeah. So I did become very interested in her, which is probably fairly understandable given that I am a female doctor interested in history. So I guess it was quite inevitable in that sense. But yeah, so she was the first woman to sort of officially qualify as a doctor in Britain. There was another doctor called Elizabeth Blackwell that had qualified in the US, but she was the first one to sort of qualify in Britain. And the way I think about her is really as very much a pioneer. So she was the first woman to do a lot of things. Not only was she the first sort of female doctor in Britain, but she was also the first dean of a medical school. She was the first female member of the BMA. She was the first female mayor. She was the first woman to set up a medical school. Like, there are so many things that she did, and she was the first person to do it. And the other thing that I really love about her as sort of a historical character, I guess, and what I feel that she can almost teach us today is that, as someone growing up in Victorian Britain, she very much put her career ahead of anything else. Lots of women, when they got married, they would stop, they wouldn't work, they would just sort of basically look after their home and have children and all that kind of thing. But she was very determined that she was going to continue her career as a doctor despite being married. And she also married comparatively late as well, because she was 34 when she got married, when the average age of women at that time to get married was like 10 years earlier than that, about 24 or 23, I think. And she also had her son, who was her third child, at the age of 40, which I think is amazing. And, I kind of love it because I feel like she is genuinely sort of a modern woman 100 years ahead of her time, because she's putting her career first. She's having a family, but not letting it get in the way of anything. And, like really managing to balance all of these different things and almost like have it all, if you see what I mean. Um, So yeah, I mean, I think she's an amazing. I mean, she's an inspiration for starters, and I think she is an amazing sort of character that we can still learn a lot from today. So yeah, that's what I like about her.
She's amazing. How did she do it then? How did she beat the system?
Well, I think a lot of determination, and she just did not give up. I think it is important to make it clear that she did have a lot of support. She had a lot of support from her family, from her later husband, and she was financially stable. So, you know, she did have the money to support this. She did have money to get private tutoring in, anatomy and things like that, which helped with her exams. She did have help. And it's probably, because of the support she got from her family, that she was able to succeed. But that didn't come without an awful lot of determination and not letting failure get in the way of what she wanted to achieve. So, she started off working as a nurse at the Middlesex Hospital. And then she gradually sort of managed to sort of inch her way into attending like dissections and some lectures and things like that. But there was a lot of resistance from the men at the time. They didn't want a woman joining their ranks, and they sort of kicked up quite a fuss, which made it even more difficult for her. She applied to lots of different medical schools. They all rejected her because she was female. And it was only because she managed to almost sort of slip through a loophole in that she managed to gain a license from the Society of Apothecaries, which meant once she passed the exam, she was able to practice medicine. That meant that she was able to sort of become a doctor, and she managed to get her MD in Paris a few years later. But she had to learn French in order to do that. Like she really had to go above and beyond, and no one made it easy for her. She had a lot of doors sort of slammed in her face repeatedly, and she really had to work very hard to succeed and to achieve her dream of becoming a doctor. And unfortunately, because she was the first woman to do all of these things, and because the male sort of medical establishment didn't like it very much, you know, as soon as when she did manage to succeed through those loopholes were very quickly closed. And so it actually made it harder for women who came after her to actually qualify as doctors as well. So there was a bit of a lag period after she managed to become a doctor until other women did manage to succeed. And it was in Edinburgh when there are people like Sophia Jex-Blake who are a little bit younger, and so were coming after her, and they managed to there were a few of them that studied at Edinburgh Medical School, and they managed to get their medical degrees that way. So, but they weren't able to do the Society of Apothecaries license like Elizabeth Garrett Anderson, because there suddenly was a new rule which said that women couldn't take it. So yeah, so it must have been, I think, for her, very isolating, because she was the only woman in this position, in this situation. And even once she'd got her qualifications, no one would employ her because she was female. And so she actually had to basically set up her own dispensary, set up her own hospital in order that she could actually practice, which is kind of crazy, and really it was certainly in the initial stages only women and children that she was able to be a doctor for. Those were the only, men wouldn't come to see her as a patient. It was only women and children. So again, that is very reflective of the time and of what things were like back then. But I think there are lots of it's interesting when you compare, because this is sort of 19th century, and very beginning of the 20th century, because Elizabeth Garrett Anderson died in, I think, 1917 or something. It's interesting when you compare it to what I study at the moment, which is sort of 17th and 18th centuries, when, women were really the primary caregivers and had a big role in caring for the family and looking after the health of the household. But that is very different when you compare that sort of domestic medicine to the sort of professionalization of medicine, which came a bit later, which was basically just, men who had gone to university and had got their degrees and then were sort of official doctors. Whereas obviously the women that were caregivers tended to be less sort of like more informal, but certainly the first port of call, especially if you were not particularly wealthy, because doctors were expensive. So it's interesting when you sort of think about that kind of situation a couple of hundred years earlier. But yeah, so.
Wow. So if anyone's been to any of the old universities, and we have some at UCL, and I was in Edinburgh actually recently, and I gave a talk in the anatomy lecture theatre. So the anatomy lecture
Oh,
theatres are where they used to wheel the bodies in. So they're very
yeah.
they've got the operating sort of area just in front of on a stage or on a platform, and then they've got these big high seating all around in an arc so
Mm,
that people
mm,
can see what the doctors are doing. So I can just picture her sort of sneaking in the back, sitting there,
mm.
listening to what they were saying. But where did she do this? Because if she'd done it at Oxford and Cambridge, she wouldn't have got a degree for till after she died. So did she do it at the University of London? And what was how did she get through to actually
No,
do the exams?
so she so she had private tutors, so she paid for private tutors so that she could learn the stuff basically, and then she managed to do the necessary qualifications to practice medicine through the Society of Apothecaries. So that was a valid way of getting a kind of the first part of a medical degree at that time. It wasn't, you didn't have to do it at, say, the University of Edinburgh or whatever. So she got it through the Society of Apothecaries, and then she did her MD in Paris. So she had to go all the way to Paris to do her MD, which again is kind of wild. And she didn't manage to do that until 1870. So at that point, she would have been 34, I think, or something. So it did take a really long time for her to basically tick all the boxes and go through all the necessary hoops, if you like, to actually be able to practice medicine. So yeah, it was very, very difficult, and she had to think about these alternative routes because all of the medical schools that she applied to rejected her because they said, well, we can't have a woman doing this degree. So yeah.
So did they not let her go into any of the lectures? Did she do it all privately?
Well, so she was able to attend a few lectures at the Middlesex, I believe, but then there was this resistance from the male medical students because they didn't like that very much, and so she was sort of ousted out, if you like, which is a bit unfair. But yeah, they obviously she was the only woman, so it was very noticeable. And yeah, I mean, lots of people said, well, medicine isn't an appropriate career for a woman. It's not good for their constitution. They can't sort of deal with it, kind of thing, emotionally or whatever. And it's just not something that women should be doing. So it was kind of frowned upon, I think, at the time. But she kind of managed to prove them all wrong, to be honest, because she ended up being a very successful doctor with lots and lots of patients. And yeah, she really did sort of pave the way for future female doctors.
It's quite interesting when you were saying there about women didn't have the constitution to be a doctor, and some of the other words you said there, very similar to what came up in the first podcast of this series on female icons, which was about Trudy Eddeley, who was the first woman to swim the English Channel. So they also said, "Oh,
Oh,
swimming is not for women. We're too
mm,
delicate.
yeah.
We can't swim. Certainly can't swim the Channel. Unheard of." So it's the barriers that these pioneering female icons have got through to achieve these things. It's absolutely amazing, absolutely stunning.
Yeah,
So you mentioned her hospital. So she set up this hospital. I believe it's called the New Hospital for Women, and you explained
yeah.
why she only treated women and children there. Um, I can't imagine how difficult that was for her to carry on. Very radical at the time.
Yeah, exactly. And as I said, she really was, until she was later joined by other female doctors, she really was one of a kind and very much, there was no formula for her to follow. There was no established pathway for her to follow. And she sort of had to almost make it up as she went along and see what worked and what didn't. So, again, like, very brave, I think, to be doing something so different at that time. So yeah, I've got a lot of admiration for her in that sense.
Yes, that's why we've called ourselves the Elizabeth Garrett Anderson Institute for Women's Health. And you mentioned that she was mayor and she had so many other roles. I mean, just amazing. What impact do you think Elizabeth's work had on women's rights then and access to education for? Well, obviously the loopholes got closed, but with her leading the way.
Yeah, I mean, so she was a big supporter of women's suffrage. Her sister, Millicent, was also a big supporter, and her daughter had a very active role, Louisa. She had a very active role in campaigning for women's rights. And yeah, I mean, she was basically, I think for her, it was very clear in her actions, the fact that she was pursuing this career, which was thought to be only, appropriate or suitable for men. And she was demonstrating to the whole world that actually, no, women are perfectly capable of doing this. Thank you very much. And so, and she did have a big role in sort of getting women the vote and leading that sort of campaign. She was a big figurehead there. She didn't take part so much in the sort of the more kind of violent aspects of that sort of campaign for women's suffrage, but she certainly did a lot of writing and a lot of talking, all of that kind of thing to support women's right to vote and all sorts of other things. So yeah, I mean, I think she demonstrated more than anything to everyone that women should have these opportunities and should be able to do all of these things that previously it had only really been that men were doing. So yeah, I mean, I think she had a massive role.
What do you think Elizabeth, would think today if she saw how medical school training was for women today?
I think she'd be very proud. Like, I mean, I think over 50% of medical school uh, students are women now, which is kind of phenomenal when you think where we've come from. So I think she'd be really proud with how things have progressed and how they've developed. And I mean, again, I still think there's work to be done, especially I do quite a bit of work at Cambridge with outreach and things, and in terms of trying to help students from underprivileged backgrounds get a flavour of what studying at Cambridge is like, because there might not be anyone in their family or anyone that they know that's been to Oxbridge, so they don't have that sense of what it's all about and why they should even bother applying, if you like. And so I think that is something that we just need to continue doing and continue pursuing, because it's one thing to manage to make it sort of almost equal in terms of women and men being admitted, but another thing to think about the other sort of socioeconomic factors that are at play, and trying to sort of increase opportunities for everyone. So yeah.
So I pulled out some numbers after I interviewed Professor Dame Leslie Regan last year, who was only the second woman to become president of the Royal College of Obs and Gynae. So the Royal College of Obs and Gynae deal with women's health issues, and we've only
Yeah.
had well, when Dame Leslie was the second president, she became president in 2016. The first was Dame Hilda Lloyd, who was president from 1949 to 1952. And for some reason, it then took decades to get another female
Mm.
president, which was unbelievable. But then I looked at some other numbers. So I believe the Royal Society has never had a female president. The British Medical Association, the first woman was 2006. Royal College of Surgeons was 2014. And the list goes on. So I think
Mm.
that's something that Elizabeth might be not so happy about. What do you think?
Yeah.
Why have we still got those barriers?
I mean, it's a really good question. I think it's probably a lot of different things. But as I say, there really is a lot of work still to sort of be done. And I think a lot of it needs to come from women themselves as well, and being like, feeling empowered, feeling like they can do these things. And why shouldn't they be in this position or have this responsibility? So I do think things are moving in the right direction, but I do think there's more, or there's further to go, if you like, because it would be lovely to see more women in those positions for sure.
I think listening to you at the beginning and how much you've achieved in your career already, and then listening to Elizabeth, I think was such a brilliant way to look at how both of you are inspiring and have done so much. And you've done a career which is quite unorthodox, which I said I'd love, and so did she. So I think that's such. I think you've been the perfect person to talk about this and to
Thank you.
talk about what it's been like to study. But to finish off, Lucy, I always ask my guests, I call the podcast Why Didn't Anyone Tell Me This? Because I always talk about things that I think everybody should know. We should all know the story about Elizabeth Garrett Anderson and how difficult the
Mm.
hurdles that those women have. So, in your work, have you heard people say to you, "Why didn't I know that? Why didn't I know this before?"
Um, so there are a couple of things I think I could bring up here. I think one of the things I find most fascinating about the sort of the manuscript recipe books and things that I look at are that often, or in some cases, there are things that people in the 17th century have observed or noticed or written down and recorded that have almost got sort of lost and then almost been sort of rediscovered, like 100, 200, 300 years later. And I kind of find that absolutely mad. It's sometimes we we look at recipes, especially medical recipes, that are from the 17th century, and we think, oh well, that was never going to work. They were so silly, like they didn't have any understanding of science, like they didn't realize that was never going to work, like what's the theory behind that, that doesn't make any sense at all, kind of thing. And we naively think that we are in a world in which we know what is scientifically true, what is fact, what is scientific fact, and we know that this is the case because of that, kind of thing. And we feel like we are very logical, and that sure, like there's some aspects of science that are still to be discovered, blah blah blah, but what we know now is what we know, and we can rely on that. And it just makes me smile when I think that, in 100 or 200 years time, people are going to be looking back at us thinking, they were so silly. Why on earth did they think that that was the way to cure cancer? Or why on earth did they think that that was the way to deal with COVID-19 or whatever? And, like, people used to laugh when people said that the world was like round and not flat, kind of thing. And then sort of, this is why history is so important, and this is why we really need to learn from it, because we can't fall into that trap of being naive in thinking that everything we know today is true. And I think you have to sort of keep that kind of open mind and keep pursuing, new discoveries and finding new ways of looking at things, because you know, there are going to be people in the future who are going to think that we did some really weird things today. And I think just keeping that in mind and having some perspective is probably the most important thing that I have learned from studying history. And I came across a recipe recently to mend broken china, and it used snail slime. So it says to go to the garden, grab some snails, rub the edge of a snail along your broken bit of china, and basically stick it together. And, there I am almost laughing at it, thinking, well, that's never going to work. And I do quite a lot of historical reconstruction in my research. So I actually carry out the recipes. And it didn't work. It didn't stick it together. But I did do some research and I discovered that actually the slime from mollusks is being used in modern clinical trials to assist with wound healing. So, sort of in the area of plastic surgery, it's actually being snail slime essentially is being used to help adhere, two edges of a wound together. And there are clinical trials that are ongoing. And I thought that was absolutely crazy. And it's one of those things that it just makes you think like, well, maybe they did know more than we give them credit for, kind of thing, in the 1600s. So I think that's the biggest lesson that I've learned from studying history and from doing these degrees and things. And I think it's sort of being a bit humble about what we think we know and keeping an open mind.
Brilliant. That's a brilliant story. I love a good story. That's really great. Who'd have thought it? Snail
Well,
slime.
exactly.
Brilliant. I'm glad it's got a use. um, so, Lucy, my final questions to all my guests, and I'm really looking forward to finding out what you're going to say about this. So, I'm quite obsessed with happiness. I think it's really important to be happy and always ask some quirky questions at the end. So, Lucy, what makes you happy and where is your happy place?
Oh my gosh, that is a very, very difficult question. I think I'm always happy when I'm doing sport, whether that is cycling or rowing, ideally in the sun and ideally with friends. And yeah, I think so. It'll be one of those two, I reckon.
Fantastic. Brilliant. And the very last question, Lucy, what advice would you give your younger self?
I would say relax, be present, and enjoy every day because life's too short to do anything else. And sometimes I feel like we spend a lot of time worrying about the little things and we forget to look at the bigger picture. Um, and that's another reason why history is so great. It's because it forces you to look at the bigger picture.
Lucy, that's been absolutely fascinating, and you are really you're a female icon. I just love honestly, I love everything you've done. It's been absolutely a pleasure talking to you, and I wish you every success in your future
Thank
career.
you.
You're obviously I love the way you've just pursued both of your passions, which seem on paper to be totally unworkable, and you've done it,
Yeah,
which is
thank
bonkers.
you.
I love it. I love it. Lucy, thank you very much for talking about your own career and that of Elizabeth Garrett Anderson. Thank you very much.
Welcome. Bye.